Welcome to MDR, Making Sense of the Vegematic Buzzword Blender. My name is Diana Kelly, and I'm CTO and co-founder at Security Curve. And co-presenting with me today is
Lisa Lee, and I'm from Microsoft. I'm the Chief Security Advisor and work in our business development area with our vertical industries.
Yes, and we both used to work together at Microsoft and did some work on MDR while we were there. So we want you to know that we are here live, even though this is a recorded session. Lisa and I are here live today too, as you're watching this. So please, if you have questions, just go ahead and enter those into the chat. And with that, we're going to get started. So Vegematic, which, I think of as a blender. I think it's actually a chopper officially, but, I think of it as like bringing things together, sort of that like the Lucy show of just bringing a bunch of stuff together. And I don't know about you, but I often feel really overwhelmed by the number of acronyms that come out, especially when there's a new area. So, I felt like I just had figured out what MDR meant. And suddenly like people were saying, well, there's MXDR and we do MTDR. And it's like, oh my gosh. So the whole reason that we came up with this talk was we thought it would be a really good thing to just walk through the differences between the kinds of offerings and to just really kind of normalize some of the pros and cons and choices and trade-offs that you can make when you're deciding if you need MDR at all, and if you do, what kind of MDR you want. So we spelled out the different acronyms on this next slide so that you can see them and know what they are. There's endpoint, network, threat, and extended. The X is extended, but that doesn't always help to really understand what they mean. So when you think about managed endpoint, we've got some slides to give you a more visual view of this. If you think about managed endpoint, right? What does that? That really means the endpoints themselves. So that would include your laptops and your desktops. It may include servers in some cases. Definitely is going to include your mobile devices and your phones and your tablets. So basically anything that's on the edge, that's the endpoint. When you're talking about managed endpoint detection and response, that means that it's going to cover both monitoring what's happening or even proactive threat hunting on those different devices, and then response if anything goes wrong. You got a piece of malware on your endpoint, then the MEDR would kick in. So as you hear these different acronyms, what they really are responding to or covering is the kind of the scope of what's in the management system. So the next one is for networks. And here you're definitely going to get servers, but you're also going to get the more traditional. If you think about like an MSSP or managed security, very often you probably go to thinking about switches and routers and firewalls. And depending on what service you buy, and it's going to depend on what's right for you, what that vendor offers. But network now starts to bring in those cases that are sort of traditional perimeter, and now in the cloud, what we've got with software-defined perimeter, things like your firewalls, your servers, and those portions of the pieces of network security could also include things like your SOC or your SIEM, what's within your SOC. And then the next one is MTDR, which Lisa's going to cover.
Yeah, so MTDR, meaning the threat detection and response. This one focuses very heavily on the threat signal. And so it's kind of that idea, one vendor talks about correlating the different threat signals to provide an automated threat detection and response. So it's really focused on the signal aspect of what's happening and the automation of that correlation. And then we have.
Yeah, when you bring it all together, you may hear MXDR. So now that you're catching on, right? You've probably seen it now. It's pretty clear that when they change that second letter, it tends to cover what's going to be part of the service. And when you get MXDR, or managed extended detection and response, most of the time what that means is that the vendor is going to bring together endpoint detection and response with network detection and response, and very often that threat signal, threat intelligence, and be able to bring all those together for a really comprehensive managed detection and response solution. And if you're thinking, wow, do I even need to have a security team? Do I even need to have a SOC if I'm going to have MXDR? Well, the answer is maybe not. Most companies are still going to need them, but some companies are looking at could MXDR be replacement, or if they can't afford a SOC, maybe looking at MXDR to kind of cover a lot of that use case.
So one of the things that we heard from a chief security officer was that they thought they had bought an XDR solution. They weren't looking for the managed aspect of it, but they wanted to augment their capabilities and their team. And what they ended up with was really just an MSSP, just a managed, really alerting system or capability. And so, when that shiny, pretty thing kind of wears off, did you really get what you thought you got? So in this case, maybe you didn't get the flying car, maybe you just got the car with a few wings and fins. But it's making sure that you're really aware of what you're buying. And we did think that this, Vegematic blender was contributing a lot to that, because the terminology is still so loose in some cases, or maybe just not being applied in the right way. So just trying to make sure that the vendor or the buyer beware, making sure that you're getting what you intended to get.
Yeah, just talking it through your provider. And this is, it happens anytime that you get a new set of offerings. Very often other vendors that have been in the space for a while, they start saying, well, we have a lot of that capability, so they want to offer it too. And that's not to say that an MSSP can't offer a really strong MDR. We're just saying, make sure that you've asked about what you're getting, because if they just say, hey, we've got wings, you may end up with a car that actually flies, or you may end up with, a cute looking car, but it's not going to go anywhere. It's kind of a penguin of a car. So it's really just about asking the questions and making sure you know what you're buying. And it really is best for you to figure out the questions in advance, because any vendor is really excited about their solution. So that old thing about, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that's going to happen. So be sure that you've thought about what your company needs and what you really want out of a service. So at a very high level, and again, MDR, the vendors have different sets of capabilities that they supply. MSSPs are moving into this space, and some of them are truly moving into the space, giving you the flying car. Some are just not getting it yet and have kind of the wings on there, but they don't fly. So we're giving you some good top level things to ask or to think about that differentiate traditional MSSPs and MDR. So the traditional MSSPs tend to be a little bit more portal based. So if you want to talk to a person, yeah, maybe you can pick up the phone, but most of what's happened is that they've got this managed. They're managing a lot of different systems and devices, and your interaction with the MSSP would be through checking your dashboard on the portal. They often are very heavy in automation in the managed service offering. They will do monitoring, but they generally stop at alerting. Again, I want to be clear that we're giving you generalizations, and you have to ask these questions to make sure what your vendor is offering. But generally, they stop at alerting. So you'll find out that something's gone wrong within the system. You'll get an alert up on your dashboard, but that may be where things stop. And very often, if there is remediation or tasks that have to get taken when there has been a breach or an incident has been identified, then that escalates to the customer, which is a great offering. And that's what a lot of companies need. That's why MSSPs have been so successful. But some companies are looking for something a little bit more proactive, a little bit more hands-on, and that's the niche that MDR is filling. Most MDR offerings have a combination of human beings with hands-on keyboards and software sensors, like they may have an endpoint solution, endpoint defense on the endpoints that they're protecting. But there's a very human element too. So these are human-based. They will act as advisors. Sometimes you can just call up, again, depending on the service. You may be able to push a button if you're doing an investigation, and you can get an expert on the other end of that line to be able to talk you through what you're seeing. So instead of just here's an alert, you get this very human element. They also can be out there actively going proactively through your network or through whichever systems you've got them covering, endpoints, for example, to look to do threat hunting. So they'll start looking at the IOAs, the indicators of attack, or proactively, which is the things that look like they're going to go wrong or look suspicious, even though you haven't had an actual breach yet. In addition to if there's a fast moving campaign, malware campaign or ransomware campaign, or some other attack campaign that's going on, they may get IOCs, these indicators of compromise may be distributed for those, and the threat hunters could take those and look through your organization. You don't know you've had an attack yet, an alert hasn't happened, but they'll start looking for the IOCs for you. So that very proactive kind of activity. And then when they do get into response, that's a very active, instead of just saying, hey, you've got an alert, somebody ought to go take care of this, your MDR provider can go from either just an automatic response all the way up to taking significant action within your enterprise based on, again, the agreement you have with them and what service they offer.
So why don't we start to look at kind of the response end of it? This is an area where there seems to be a lot of differentiation and a lot of variety in the ways that even organizations would approach it, especially CISOs and how they want to look at it. And we've kind of broken this into a spectrum. And if you think about the spectrum, looking at there's a top and a bottom, and there are two different approaches. And that seems to be how a lot of the organizations and CISOs that we were talking to were reflecting on how much they wanted in terms of response. In one case, they're looking at it from the action-based side. And so they may be thinking in terms of, I only want the provider to, provide alerts, which really isn't managed detection and response at that point, but it's kind of that first stage. And the next stage, getting more in terms of how much response they would provide around are they actually investigating? Or are they getting involved in taking action on specific assets? Would they be resetting certain settings, or actually quarantining something, an asset in that sense? And then does the customer want them to take a full response action? And so that's at the far end of the spectrum, is taking full response. So that's where it's almost full augmentation of your team. If we look at the bottom side of the spectrum, other organizations or other CISOs might look at it from a severity-based rating. So they want to be able to differentiate between, if it's a SEV1 item, these really low risk items, or maybe the more frequent types of things like phishing attacks. That's where they want help and augmentation. And others say, no, I want to be on the full end of the spectrum in terms of, the SEV4, SEV5, depending on how many levels you may have. And so it's just a different way of looking at, how much interaction do you want? And where is that third party going to step in? And it's really important to have a clear understanding of where that separation is, in terms of who's doing what, where the handoff lies, and trying to keep the blur out of the lines completely, so that your spectrum is very clear and there's a differentiated line between where the third party takes over or where the handoff happens. And so another way to look at this as well would be to think about it in terms of, finding the balance of the risk. And so, do you want more expertise and less access, or, more access? And, it's just finding the balance of how much you're willing to have that third party involved. So it's about that appetite that you might have for that. Is it more important to throw bodies at the really simple stuff and to maintain your own team, who are highly paid, professionals probably, to keep them for the really complicated issues or the complicated incidents? Also, what about, post event or post incident? Can the vendor rebuild or recover your environment? Maybe they could do that faster than your team can in certain settings. And so, what's going to be the balance there in terms of, who has that? And getting that kind of rebuilding service, for example, can be really important, and it can be a real big value add for some teams. There may be other things where, again, that expertise versus access needs to be weighed in terms of, like if you need to reset all the passwords in the environment, could the vendor, potentially do that more easily for you than you could do for yourselves? So really important, again, just to make sure that you have those clear lines of distinction, that clear line of demarcation between the authority and the authorization, if there is going to be some sort of handoff.
Yeah, and exactly that. There's no right or there's no wrong about this. there's what's right for your company. So there is, again, you just making sure that you think through what you want and what's best for your organization. Another big decision point in as you talk to your potential MDR, and we're just conflating all the acronyms, we're just going to call MDR. But as you're talking to your MDR provider, is whether or not you bring your own stack, BYOS, or if you take the stack that they have, because there's a few different models here. So you can bring your own stack, which means that you say, these are my endpoints. These are the agents. This is the security agent I like having on my endpoint. This is what I have for a firewall. This is what I'm using for the cloud. I'm going to bring everything that I have already in my own stack, my technology, my security stack. I'm going to bring it to you, and I want you to manage the detection and response using my own stack, my own technology. You can also go with a vendor that they are an MDR provider, but they don't build their own endpoints, for example. They don't build their own sensors for servers. What they do is they talk to other companies. They pick and choose what they think is the best curated security stack for organizations and experience. And then they build out an offering that they think is going to be the most comprehensive. And then there's the next option is a vendor built stack. So it could be that the vendor has built their MDR, so that's the sensors and the security components that are going to go on the endpoints and the servers and within the network. They've built out all of that themselves. And then they say you buy the service, you are also buying that stack because they come together. And then the last option, and this one is actually coming from a lot of MSSPs, is that they may do a bit of a blended. They can say, this is our stack, and this is what we recommend and what we use, what most of our customers use. However, if you want to bring a couple of pieces from your stack, that's okay. And we can do that for you too. So you have the option. That's the most important thing to take away from the stack talk. Initial part is that all of these different models, there's you have the choice, whichever model is right for you. And the next slide, I've got those some pros and cons about them that may help you to make a decision on one of these, one or the other. So looking at the bring your own stack, where you tend to get a real, a real up on this one is the big pro is that you have a very limited lock-in. If you decide that you don't want to work with that MDR vendor anymore, it's your stack, you just pick it up and you can go and you can take it with you. Now, with your staff, though, you may have some things to think about here because you're bringing your own stack and they may need to do a lot of the same work that they've been doing to manage and maintain that stack before. And then integration is another consideration when you're bringing your own stack, because if you've done the work to integrate those different pieces of your security stack, that's great. You can now that is an advantage for the MDR provider. But if you haven't done the integration, then you may get some things like some of the black holes or blind spots that come out of it. So if you want to bring your own stack, if you're a really mature program within your security program and you know what you've picked because you have a lot of regulatory needs, maybe bring your own stack. You don't want to replace it. You don't want what the vendor's going to provide. You want them to manage your stack. In vendor supplied, you very often have a much tighter integration because that's one thing the vendors worked on. But if they're supplying the stack, now you've got a little bit of lock-in because you could either go and buy all those tools somewhere else, but you're buying the tools from the vendor. And then the staff intact can be a little bit blended there because they may not know how to use this new tooling that the provider has. So vendor supplied, good for an easy start because they say you don't have to worry about it. We're going to supply the stack for you, and you have some pretty low decision overhead. But remember, you are getting some element of lock-in. With the vendor build, you have a very tight lock-in because now they built it and they manage it for you. So they've got both sides of that. If that's the right stack for you, then that's great because the integration, of course, if it's vendor built and they're doing the management, you've got the tightest set of integration possible. You've also got the biggest benefit for your staff because in most cases, the MDR provider is now going to be doing most of that resource work. So you're going to be able to, lift and ease some of the resources for your own staff. But again, you do have that lock-in because you've got the vendor providing both the technology stack and the managed services, but you've got that big up of a highly integrated solution. And then in blended, it's a little bit of a mix on all of these because it's going to depend on your provider, what you've blended, and your own resources. So the blended is going to be the most up in the air. We have to think about what your pros and cons are, but it's going to give you a lot of flexibility. And if you do have special regulatory needs within your stack, you're going to be able to, like in the full bring your own stack, you can also have that supported in the blended.
So one of the next areas to think about is in terms of visibility. How much of your own environment can the provider cover? How much visibility will they have into your environment? And think about across the third-party systems that you may have, or even the operating systems that you may have. Diana mentioned, thinking about the blind spots that might pop up. Are there potential issues with multi-cloud environments where maybe they won't have visibility? And how much access do they need? Will they be able to see different data types, or will they just be able to see labels? And is there a provider that for your particular environment who can see all the way across? And is that what you need? So these are, just some sort of key questions around visibility. And then the other side of that is really on the privacy side of it. Looking at, how much access are you extending to them? In terms of if they have access to data, are they able to see your confidential data like the PII, the health information, and so forth? And looking back at your spectrum of decision, that spectrum may help you decide, what kind of impact there may be to privacy because of the access that you may be providing. Is it possible that data classification could be a control factor in the sense that maybe they can just see the data classification labels, but not actually have access to the data itself? Would that provide enough for the types of either investigation or incident management, that they're able to take the actions that you require? And then just in terms of the vendor trust, is it possible that if it's a particular vendor that's providing the service and they've already done the background checks and the experience checks and so forth, and you feel comfortable with the reviews that they're doing, will that somehow offset some of the due diligence that you might do of the vendor, or that might be required? So is that gold seal, is that enough for the review that you need? And then in terms of the power of threat intel, just thinking about, is your intel good enough or not? More intel is always better in most cases. If you're able to sort through it, if you're able to correlate it, is it possible that maybe your threat intel is lacking in some areas? So is there a big benefit here? So maybe you need that kind of augmentation. And in terms of, indicators of compromise and indicators of attack, do you need both? Thinking about your own environment and the types of threats that you're seeing and the types of incidents that you're seeing, the better detection, it's really going to help you a lot. But the correlation is so key to that. So for example, if you are walking into a forest and someone's telling you that there are a lot of snakes in the forest, that's great information. But if you know that most of those snakes are poisonous, then that becomes really important. So, correlating the different pieces just becomes very valuable. And how well will the service that you're getting integrate with the existing feeds that you already may have? Who's monitoring what? This is where that handoff or that line of segmentation becomes very important. So you make sure that there's absolutely no gap, no area that's going uncovered merely because there was a misunderstanding.
Yeah, and then that leads to, with your staff augmentation and that question of who needs MDR. When I first started hearing about MDR, I heard about it being deployed at smaller mid-sized companies as almost a replacement for security staff. And I thought, wow, a big company would never need it. But then doing research and speaking to CISOs, I realized that no, it actually, again, it's this spectrum. So at the very mature or well-resourced programs, they're interested in MDR because they want a second set of eyeballs, or in this case, a whole bunch of set of eyeballs, because they have these live people on the other side that are also hunting through your network looking for anything that's amiss. So, some very big, well-resourced companies are finding it's very valuable. Also, companies that are experienced, but they just don't have the money or the resources right now to do FTE hires, they can find that MDR really helps augment their very already experienced program, but under resource program. And then there are also for some programs that, as sort of expected, that they haven't gotten the maturity, they need some help with that. They also need help with resources. And in that case, it can be a real lifeline to have MDR to augment. The next thing that you should think about is how much automation. So we know that we talked about humans and what the humans are going to do, and that they're hunting over activity within your systems. But there's also a lot of automation that's included with these solutions, and just automation is one of those things that tends to be really, really appealing. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if I would still want an automated driving car. I hate to drive, and I would love to have a car that just push a button, but we're not quite there, right? Because cars run into problems, they get confused, they sometimes do unprotected left turns when they shouldn't. A whole lot of things happen with automation. So just keep that in mind when you're talking to the vendor about what they can give you for true automation, and then where you might want to limit or scope that. Because what can happen in automation gone bad is that you break your system, you create business interruption, and now people can't get to a critical workload or a critical server, or your mail stops working. There are a lot of things that can happen when you start turning things on and off automatically. So talk it through with your vendor, make sure what you're comfortable with. Overall, automation can be extremely helpful in these sort of low impact decisions and actions. So if it's, I've got an endpoint and there's malware on it, sure, automatically clean that out. You want to do that as fast as possible. If it's something that's a little bit higher impact, like reset everybody's password at the company, you might want to have a human involved in that decision chain.
So also don't ignore the questions and the things that you need to consider around reports and audits. And then we'll talk about some future state considerations too. But in terms of reports, what kind of output do you need? Over time, can you get the kind of analytics that'll really help you? Analytics on the types of incidents that might have flared up and were they resolved? Can you get reports on the response actions that were taken? And can you clearly link those to a specific individual? Do you have the kind of forensics that you'll need? I like to think about it in terms of, if I had to go to court with this, do I have an adequate case? Do I have enough information to prove what happened, to prove who did what, when, and maybe even why? And so that comes into play also with the audit side of it, making sure that you have appropriate evidence for your auditors as well as your regulators, if that applies to you, making sure that those audit trails are sufficient, again, to show, who touched what, what did they actually see or access, and what kind of change was made. And, can you clearly demonstrate who did that? Because that's so critical, both in terms of audits as well as those legal cases that may pop up. Will your audit trails be enough? Will they be sufficient and have enough information in them? And, can that MXDR gold seal that we talked about, is that going to be enough to stand in for your due diligence, or are you going to need something more? And so, making sure that the steps that the vendor is taking to review their own team and their personnel is adequate, or that you're doing your own. Now, in terms of future state, is it possible that an MXDR can really step in to provide a service for you in a merger and acquisition? So for example, if you've acquired a company and you're not comfortable, you don't know enough about them yet to know whether you trust their team to identify incidents and respond to incidents adequately, could it be possible that this type of service could step in the case of a merger or an acquisition and provide that kind of comfort that you need? What about the access that third parties may have, or the trade secrets that they have, and the highly sensitive data. Maybe you don't feel comfortable with the controls that they have around that. You don't want anything leaking out. This might be another one of those in terms of, knowing that they can take adequate response in an incident so that, data isn't getting taken off, knowing that they can shut it down, and knowing the process that they would go around that. And then again, does this become sort of a gold seal for partners? If you know that they're using a service from a vendor that you trust, and you not only trust, but you've reviewed their process and their systems, do you feel comfortable then with that partner? Does that make you feel better about your supply chain?
Exactly. And the last high level thing to think about as you're getting ready to talk to your vendors and maybe buy one of these services or solutions is what's your total cost of ownership? And make sure you get your metrics in place. Every year, the Ponemon Institute comes out with a cost of data breach report where they show, well, that if you can get down your MTTR, your mean time to identify, mean time to contain, and mean time to respond to incidents, that's going to save you a lot overall on the cost of the incident. So is the MDR going to be able to supply that? We've talked about blind spots, but what about, can the MDR also see things that maybe that you weren't able to see before? Are you now able to reduce your staff, which is going to save the company money, or maybe repurpose your staff because you've got very high level resources that don't need to go do the hunting necessarily. Now they can do some more strategic work at your company. A lot of different ways to get a TCO, but make sure again that you find your metrics so you can validate. And then this one, at Lisa, you introduced your own Vegematic, so I'm going to let you talk to those last
Yeah, we just threw our own alphabet in there. So a lot of people like to talk about ROI, but maybe what you need to be looking at is the value of the service or the return on the service, more so than, return on investment. And so that may just be, that was just our fun way of throwing a couple extra alphabets in there.
Yeah, so we hope that this has helped giving you a good overview of what to think about so that you're not just feeling bombarded by vendor noise and acronyms, that you just kind of break it down that these are really great services doing different kinds of detection and response, and think about in advance what kind of problem you want to solve before you talk to your vendor, and make some decisions about, do we want our own stack? Are we trying to reduce staffing costs? What's the right part of the response spectrum for us? Think those through in advance so that when you talk to the vendor, you're going to get the solution that's right for you. And don't forget also to normalize your questionnaire so that you can get apples to apples responses. Sometimes vendors say the same things, but with very different words. So you want to make sure that you've got your idea of technically what controls you want, what return you want, what your own metrics are, so that instead of you getting caught in the Vegematic, you're going to be the one who's, upfront driving the decision.
And so we hope that we've, given you all of the, or at least a lot of the information that you need to make the analysis. So how do you get started? In the next week, you can really sit down and define your problem set, which I think includes an assessment of your current capabilities. So what problem are you trying to solve, but also what capabilities do you have toward that problem already? And consider where you might be on the spectrum. Where would you want to give access, versus what type of incident or response would they have? So where are you on the spectrum of response, but also where are you on the balance of the risk?
And in the next 3 months, if you do want to purchase an MDR, if after you've defined your problem set, you think this is right, start talking to the vendors and assessing them and building out your RFP. And in 6 months, you should.
In 6 months, you want to think about that shiny, pretty thing that you were looking for. Did you get the flying car, or was it just a shiny, pretty thing?
Yeah, you get hitting those metrics. Have you been better with breaches? At least breaches may occur even with MDR, but are you responding more quickly? So starting to look at that, and maybe even if you start to catch things that before loss occurred. So we wish you a lot of luck with your MDR deployments. We have some resources here in the last slide for you to take a look at that we think as now that you've got this great baseline or high level overview or framework, there are some great resources out there. I particularly like the detect mappings in NIST. There's the Ponemon cost of data breach that I had talked about. And then also there's a CIS response plan template for the NIST CSF that may help with responding to a cyber incident. So we wish you great luck in your response and detection work, and we hope that this helped give you a better view of the overall managed detection and response market.
And we're
So,
looking forward to answering your questions as well.
yes, thank you so much.